Hello, Proponomics people, and welcome to the Sunday supplement from the 3rd of March 2024. And this one I've called Boing. So, as you'll know, I like to start with a quote, and this week's is rising unemployment and the recession have been the price that we've had to pay to get inflation down. Labour shouts. That is a price well worth paying. And that was from Norman Lamont, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, from a speech in the House of Commons from the 16th of May 1991. So before we begin, Rod Turner and I ran a property business workshop in January in London. We covered a wide range of topics, all the way from what a great investment looks like, to how to operate more than one company, why you would do that, how you might structure it, all the way down to a whole host of productivity hacks and general January fitness activities for your businesses. We enjoyed it, got some great feedback and met some great people too. We're going to run another one with fresh content including due diligence, both on business partners and with a view to lending money, joint ventures, mergers and acquisitions, and some accompanying case studies on some easy and more complex deals that we've done. The tickets for the next one are a link in the show notes. The date for the next one is Wednesday the 24th of April, and there's still a discount for the early birds that's ending very soon, so don't be shy. So, the march into March. One of the great things about writing the supplement is that anchor in the week, the check-in. On an individual level, how did the week go from a business perspective? From a personal perspective, I get to reflect as I sit and write. That's where this week's quote came from, reflection. I have on a few occasions harked back to the 1990s as the place to look for lessons about inflation that looks and feels a bit like this. The 1970s was cited as people got excited, talked about runaway inflation, stagflation and oil price shocks. However, there were lessons learned back then that have definitely influenced policy decisions this time around. The 1990s, not so much, and a more similar root cause to an extent, with financial and geopolitical factors at play in a frictional sense rather than on a war footing. But as Lamont's quote shows, the Route 1 philosophy for solving inflation, destroying consumption, was the 1990s solution, whereas the warning shots of returning to what's been deemed normal interest rates has, at the moment, and we're nowhere near the end of the cycle, the Bank of England's 70% of the rate rises have taken effect, as cited last week, sounds hopeful. That's all led to the approach to a relatively soft landing. Unemployment could be reframed here though as unemployment plus inactive. We're 75% employed in the 16 to 65 category, as opposed to 76.2 before the pandemic. That doesn't look obvious at all at the macro level when you only focus on unemployment, where the figure remains very similar to pre-pandemic. Also, working hours are a couple of hours a week shorter on average per person for full-time employees. Consumption finally did drop significantly in Q4 of 2023, and the measure of just how much was particularly stark around Christmas time. I'm still very sceptical of the hugely dropping retail figures in December 23 and the immediate recovery in January 24, but time will tell. As I revealed a couple of weeks back, the standard period for revision of macro figures is 3 years in total. The moral of the story in 1991 was that somehow the incumbents held on and were given another chance. Their hard choices, although there were definite missteps along the way, did solve inflation and laid the foundations for a 15-year boom, which morphed into uncontrollable and unsustainable credit growth that no one did anything about, but moved average wages, healthcare outcomes, and a whole number of other very important macro metrics forward in a very big way. The overblowing and gorging on boundless credit then led to a big bubble that burst, of course, as you will know. That wasn't really in any way politically motivated. The right of the US system did as little or even less than the centre-left of the UK system did at the time. There's no way, I don't think, that anyone believes 2008 would have been particularly different under a Conservative administration. However, it did set a pretty incredible set of expectations which were then impossible to keep up with, as the decision was taken to cushion the blow of 2008 over what should have been around 20 years. Instead, there were 12 until the pandemic. At the same time, the incredibly cheap debt that resulted from the great financial crisis, whilst underwritten in a much better way, was incredibly easy to service, of course, and led to booms in private equity and debt-fueled takeovers. Then, some of those are ticking time bombs now, And that's one of the other reasons why I'm more sceptical over the 70% claim from the Bank of England, and I'm worrying we're becoming overconfident, especially in terms of the rhetoric around cutting rates being the way forward, when there's still a 10 to 15% chance the rate might have to go to where it should have been last September, and perhaps beyond that. I've reflected across the pond a number of times in this cycle, and spoken of how the US are ahead of the UK in the cycle. Their recession that never was, their technical recession of 2022, is 12 plus months further behind them than ours is. Their CPI path even looks pretty similar to ours in the rearview mirror. The halving of the rate, theirs was 6% down to 3% between Feb 23 and June 23. Ours was 7.9 to 3.9, June to November 23. So it seems reasonable to look to them for the way ours might pan out. So since June 23, CPI has simply bumbled around that 3% level in the US. They have slightly different names for the types of inflation they measure, but there's a similar focus on core inflation and even a super core notion that doesn't get measured as far as I'm aware of in the UK. Keep it at a high level though. They've done okay on a growth footing, 2.5% plus, but failed to get inflation to move at all on the needle since June last year. There's often a stubbornness of around 12 months, as I noted when first analysing the likely path of this inflation cycle, whilst Team Transitory were busy navel-gazing and speculating how quickly all of this would pass. Indeed, their CPI ticked back from 3% up to 3.7. This is what ours might look like around April 2024, due to cuts in the energy price cap, but trailing inflationary headwinds. Many have been convinced that in April we'll hit 2% or go under it, but I think they've generally failed to see the writing on the wall with things like large wage rises, services inflation still being over 6% and the likes. Printing a high 2s and then going back into the 3s and 4s is a more likely outcome in my view. It is a strange phenomenon because genuine growth inflation is our only way out of the extra debt burden created by the pandemic and the response to the pandemic. Any party of any colour can see that, but can never really talk about it, even though people still don't really understand or particularly care too much about inflation. When wages don't keep pace, you have a social unrest situation, or at the very least a large amount of industrial action. Sure, that's mostly played out now, with a couple of outliers still holding out for their settlements, and the government happy to play a war of attrition against them. Whether they'll hold out for the election, or get a sweetheart deal when election date is set, at least internally, we'll see. Anyway, that opening salvo ballooned into an opening 1,200 words. So, for reasons of expedition, I'm going to move on with the macrometrics roundup for this week. As usual, 4 to discuss. The CPI distributive trades needs a mention due to the surprise results. The mortgage lending figures are of course of interest. The money supply figures are also out for January. And, of course, last but never least, the bond and swap yields. On to the distributive trades then. A survey of businesses taking the retail temperature of the country in a quicker fashion than waiting for the monthly retail figures. The forecast was -47 on the back of a -50 print last month. That was the lowest since 2020, but the outcome was actually -7. Still negative, but a lot less negative than expected, and a sign that cautious optimism may be on the horizon. Cuts in investment by retail businesses are still there, but at a much lower differential than this survey over the past 12 months or so. The call to the Chancellor, in anticipation of next week's budget, is to cap business rates increases for retail business particularly. Mortgage lending has made a few headlines in recent times. The simple reality is that mortgage take-up scaled back significantly last year, with rates escalating as much as they did. Credit was and is available, very much, but expensive in comparison to recent years anyway. There are 2 particular areas of interest to look at here. Firstly, mortgage approvals, seen as a good bellwether of the health of the market for buyers, of course. Your average, a dangerous word as you know, healthy market would generate between 65 and 70,000 mortgage approvals per month. In 2021, this tipped over 100,000 mortgage approvals per month, a sign of a bubbly market, of course. Once Truss had done her bid and bond yields had surged, we hit a cycle low under 40,000 in January 2023. With the same sort of level of bond pricing, or actually a bit higher, there was volatility last year back up to above 50,000 per month, June 23, and then back under 45,000 quite quickly afterwards due to that second wave of yield surge, which is not often talked about, but actually had higher yields than post-Truss. That subsided, and we had our best month since late 2022 in January 24, with approvals over 55,000. 55,227 to be precise. I'd expect February to have been significantly better than that. Once again, we find ourselves in that place of cautious optimism, well below par in absolute terms, but unmistakably heading in the right direction. And then there's net mortgage lending. Do we pay down? A decision that many property investors ask all of the time at the moment. Is it the best way to get access to a savings account? Or are people having to bridge the gap between what their monthly payment will be in the new world of rates and are using savings to get those balances down, to soften the blow or in caution? As discussed last week, we're saving at a fairly aggressive level in the UK right now, and perhaps this is where some of those savings are going. The consensus was to expect a small increase in net mortgage balances across the board of about £200 million or so. The result instead was a net payback of nearly £1.1 billion, so a fair miss given we're not talking about a ridiculous amount of mortgages each month. Consumer behaviour right now is not what's being modelled, and perhaps this reduced consumption is finally going to put the nail in the inflation coffin after all. It's a beautifully soft landing if it all works out this way, but it still looks like a 50-50 to me, rather than a 70-30 in favour. I'm now going to quote from the Bank of England's statistical report directly because there's a few points that are fairly eye-popping, and then some commentary afterwards from me. So, individuals repaid on net 1.1 billion of mortgage debt in January compared to 0.9 billion in December. As I said, a miss on the consensus forecasts of 1.3 billion. Net mortgage approvals for house purchases rose from 51,500 in December to 55,200 in January. Net approvals for remortgaging remained stable at 30,900 in January. Not unhealthy, not roaring back to a healthy market quite yet though. The effective interest rate, that's the actual interest paid on newly drawn mortgages, fell by 9 basis points to 5.19% in January. 5.34 was the cycle high in November 2023. At that level, around 40 to 45% of mortgages would have been above the magic 5.5% stress test level, which was of course in place since 2012, but not massively above that, and of course would have been on fixed rates, so scored for affordability accordingly. What I'm saying is uncomfortably close to real crunch times. 5.19% still isn't great when you look at the market promising 4% rates or thereabouts in their marketing, and is a much more accurate temperature taker. This needs to get back under 4.5% to get mortgage approvals back to the 70,000 plus level monthly, in my opinion. Net borrowing of consumer credit by individuals rose to 1.9 billion in January from 1.3 billion in December. Is this just borrowing to pay for the after effects of Christmas? I'm concerned about where the buy now pay later data appears in these figures, and I'm inquiring that with the Bank of England. Households deposited on net 6.8 billion with banks and building societies in January 24. Savings are increasing. That trend started in September 23 and is continuing. There was also a relatively less attractive result for the savers in January because the effective rate paid on individuals' new time deposits with banks and building societies fell by 27 basis points to 4.53%. The effective rate on the outstanding stock of time deposits increased by 5 basis points to 3.76 in January, and the effective rate on stock sight deposits increased by 4 basis points to 2.07. So when you hear the words time deposits, think about building society bonds. For sight deposits, think about instant access savings accounts. Then UK non-financial businesses borrowed on net 0.3 billion, up from 0.1 billion in December. Businesses are borrowing less, and this trend has been the case since the middle of last year as rates went up and up. Including all SMEs, there has been net repayment now, rather than net borrowing, for 10 months. How does C-bills and bounce-back loans affect this figure, of course? In many SMEs, they're still creating their own kind of mini-fiscal drag. The net flow of sterling money, known as M4EX, continued to be volatile month on month. M4EX fell by 0.6 billion in January, compared to an increase of 19.4 billion in December. As seen in recent months, flows have largely been driven by movements in non-intermediate other financial corporations' holdings of money. These holdings decreased by 6.9 billion in January, compared to an increase of 15 billion in December. And the flow of sterling net lending to private sector companies and households, M4LEX, amounted to minus 3.5 billion in January, down from 6.4 billion in December. It was mainly driven by a decrease in the flow of lending to NIOFCs. So those last 2 points segue us nicely into the money supply. I prefer to look at M2. The bank gets more interested in the shadow banking sector because it's less regulated and more difficult for them to control, of course, but should spend more time assessing the root cause and implementing solutions as to why the shadow lending and banking sector exists and has got quite so large in my view. And M2 moved from 2.46 trillion in January 2020 to 3 trillion or so. It's reduced slightly month on month. That's January 2024's figure. This is an increase of just under 22%, an incredibly close number to the amount of inflation there has been since the 1st of Jan 2020, depending on exactly what you're measuring and how. This is interesting when you go with my across the pond comparison. The M2 increase in the US in the same time period is 36.2%. This is a country that has suffered less inflation in headline terms than the UK, fairly significantly less. It's also managed to grow a lot more than the UK. The real household disposable incomes, which is my preferred household temperature taking measure, look similar in the US as to the UK, but a few months further on, probably in a pattern that the UK will struggle to repeat. But I echo my broken record point around April wage rises, and it seems we're having a go. It also seems, to Mr. Hunt's disappointment, I'm sure, that a relatively robust economy and solid growth figures are not going to guarantee Mr. Biden, if indeed he is the candidate, an election victory. I wouldn't be surprised if this election had the longer term result of a constitutional amendment in the States. As an aside, you can't stand for president already if you're under 35. The amendment may well say you also can't stand if you're over 75 or over 80 or similar. This will all be after the event, of course, perhaps many years after. It's a Hobson's choice of truly generationally epic proportions at this point, the American election. So, back to that money supply. The first really favourable metric of comparison between the two countries in favour of the UK. It is possible that inflation can be contained if that money supply metric remains under control. The issue is, of course, that it is not completely controlled by the Bank of England. The monetarist school may well be celebrating the control of inflation, however, although the figures will still need to play ball at some point, which they aren't going to do in the next few months in a meaningful way. But that leads us to the yields. We opened the week on the gilts at 3.912% yield on the 5-year and closed it just the right side of that psychological barrier at 3.996. There was a breakout above 4.1 on Thursday for a short while, presumably because of the better than expected mortgage lending figures, although I'm not sure that had any substance to it. A healthier housing market does suggest stronger for longer on rates is okay, but not in any meaningful way, I wouldn't have thought. The Nationwide supported this on an ongoing basis, as always, by being first to the presses with their February figures, 0.7% up for the month and 1.2% up for the year, compared to consensus forecasts of plus 0.3 and plus 0.7, as the market continues to outperform expectations. It will be interesting to see how long this goes on before the minds start to change in the doom-mongering media, but the election will likely come along at an appropriate point to stall this fledgling market. The swaps also managed to stay below the bond yield still, even in the face of slightly higher demand. This speaks to just how low demand still is, in absolute terms for mortgages, at around 20% below healthy levels. And price sensitivity, forced or elected, is the clear reason. At the close on Thursday, the UK 5-year gilt was around 4.04%, whereas the last 5-year swap was traded 3.964. A discount. That's handy for the borrowers. That leaves 2 remaining points, one for the soapbox and one for those who enjoy the analytical pieces. First, I talked in detail last week about the Bank of England in front of the Treasury Committee, and my tinfoil hat part was that the person currently advising Jeremy Hunt's Treasury might get the gig as Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, ahead of someone who had already served 6 years on the committee, in spite of the fact that the committee is losing its most experienced member by some way, Ben Broadbent, this summer. It seemed clear that the politically expedient appointment, made by the Chancellor and the Prime Minister of course, would be the Hunt Treasury Insider. And so it came to pass this week as it was announced that Claire Lombardelli would join the committee as the Deputy Governor for Monetary Policy. Nothing to see here of course, but any votes from Lombardelli that aren't downwards from her appointment in July onwards would be a surprise to me. Let's just leave it at that. Okay, catharsis is complete. The other report I read with interest this week was the Zoopla February market report on their house price index. The tale of the tape was fairly straightforward. Prices down 0.5% year on year on Zoopla numbers. 15% more sales agreed in Feb versus Feb 23. That's some correlation with the mortgages agreed numbers there as well, of course. 21% more homes on the market than there were a year ago. So the sellers are back to the market in volume. Of the 12 regions Zoopla consider, 7 are up in value and 5 are down. The Zoopla see the market splitting into 3 tiers. Southern England, London and the rest of the UK, defined by affordability. Activity has been boosted by falling mortgage rates, which have now stopped falling. The outcome expected is more sales rather than price growth, and sales volume for 2024 is now expected to be 1.1 million, which is 10% more than 2023. I've come to have great respect for Richard Donnell, the Exec Director of Research at Zoopla. When I disagree with him, and work that bears his name, it tends to be a nuanced or even pedantic disagreement, rather than a directly contrary position. I think their call of falling prices in 2024 is wrong, and I've said so. They've started to soften that language now, only 2 months in. My 4% midpoint prediction still looks a lot more accurate than their sideways or slightly down prediction to me, and I'll happily have a 50p wager I end up closer than they do. To be clear, the new supply is lower than the sales agreed. The 21% represents the outcome of a year where more has come to the market than has been removed on it, down to low sales volumes. 15% agreed and only 10% replacement stock coming through at this time. Zoopla sees the current market as 1.5% off the top on their numbers, which was October 2022. That feels very close, maybe just a month or so late from the real peak. With respect to their 3-tier market, southern regions, the east, the southeast, ex-London and the southwest, have seen the biggest price falls. As a rule, they are 30% on average more expensive than the typical UK house. London's doing better in Zoopla's eyes on the back of a 7-year lull in pricing. This makes sense. There was a bubble in London caused by international cash injections of over £100 billion coming into that market from 2009 to 2015. There was no particular burst, just some time to let inflation take its effect in a slow period. That's made affordability better in spite of high pricing and therefore puts London in a better position. I would add to that, London also underperformed the rest of the UK in capital growth terms in the COVID dividend period and was the lowest region in terms of capital growth, almost half of some of the figures touted for the South West or Wales. The lack of COVID dividend also put them in a stronger position to kick on when inflation and wage rises took hold. The rest of the UK has house prices 28% below the average, almost a mirror of Region 1. In reality, both of those regions should be looked at as a percentage with them taken out of the denominator, which would exacerbate those percentages even more. See, as I told you when I disagree, it is nuanced or pedantic. On rates, it's worth quoting directly from the report. Buyers should anticipate 4 to 5% mortgage rates over much of 2024. Our consistently held view is that 5% mortgage rates are the tipping point for annual house price falls. Mortgage rates over 6 for a sustained period would lead to larger double-digit falls. Mortgage rates in the 4 to 5 range are consistent with flat to low single-digit price rises. So interestingly now they're talking about single-digit price rises. There is a psychological reason for picking the tipping points on the absolute number, although the mathematical science behind it should be questioned. In this article you can see that the average completion is drawing down nearly 1% higher or more than the best buy rate. That's 5.19 versus 4.09. Although you need to look at the best buy rate from 2 or 3 months ago rather than today to get a fair comparison to allow for the time lag in completions. The difficulty in going further is understanding what mortgage rates are being referred to really. I've used that as this week's image because Zoopla blend their data with the Bank of England to come up with a number. and the number as they see it today is 4.4%. You can get 4.29 as I write this. There isn't too much reasoning behind it being only sales volume growth rather than price growth. Certainly not anything data-based. It sounds like they're anchoring the analysis by what they've forecasted rather than digging further. The reality, though, is that if rates do fall from here and we go into a bond bull market, which I expect us to do at some point, even if it's a relatively slow one, then prices are more likely to accelerate away than volumes are to rise. Will we see those swap rates back at 3.25 before the end of 2024? If we do, expect my pricing estimations to be too low, although I am aware that the election will knock the steam out of the market somewhat. And then one more shout out for a surprise call I had this week, which I enjoyed. It wasn't a long conversation. It was one self-confessed data geek calling another. The excitement was discussing a stat that has 98% correlation with the land reg data 5 months into the future was palpable. Once I'm cleared to say more, I definitely will do, but now casting the future land reg data could be a very valuable tool to have in the toolkit. I'm sure you'd agree. So the short term looks bright enough without anything too obvious to knock this market off its perch. Trappy, great for the hard workers, loads of deals out there. Vendors now think it's 2023 rather than 2022. All lined up very well in my operation for purchases in the first 2 months of 2024 thus far, and we're looking forward to doing more and having a good year, even if the green shoots only take us to the lower end of my forecast in terms of pricing. So next week, make sure to order your coffee pods or whatever you need well in advance, because there will have been a budget in the interim period. Congratulations as always for getting to the end, and don't forget that property business workshop on Wednesday the 24th of April. Tickets for you or anyone you know who might be interested will be available at the link in the show notes. It's bit.ly/PBWTWO if you want to hit that up in Google right now. So, onwards, upwards, and we spring into March. Just remains to say, keep calm and carry on.